Welcome. Tonight we step back into 1897, into a world that refused to believe what it saw, as we uncover the astonishing story of Lydia Johnson, a young black girl whose intelligence was so extraordinary that even the leading minds of her era could not explain it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and if stories grounded in real archives, forgotten records, and careful fact-checking matter to you. Take a moment to subscribe, because every episode like this demands Dan's deep research, cross-checking old sources, and separating truth from myth. America in 1897 was a nation standing at a dangerous crossroads, calling itself modern while still clinging tightly to brutal old beliefs. The Civil War had ended only a few decades earlier, yet freedom on paper had not translated into equality in real life. Jim Crow laws were tightening across the South, segregation was becoming law, and violence was often used to enforce racial hierarchy. For Black Americans, survival itself required caution, silence, and constant awareness of invisible boundaries that could never be crossed without consequence. Science during this era claimed to be objective, but it was deeply entangled with racism. Many respected scientists openly promoted theories of racial superiority, measuring skulls, cataloging intelligence, and publishing papers meant to prove that black people were biologically inferior. These ideas were taught in universities, printed in newspapers, and accepted by the public as truth. Intelligence was believed to be fixed, inherited, and strictly limited by race, an assumption that shaped how every black child was judged before they ever spoke a word. Education reflected this cruelty. Black schools, where they existed at all, were underfunded, overcrowded, and often staffed by teachers struggling with scarce resources. Books were outdated, facilities were poor, and expectations were kept intentionally low. A black child showing intelligence beyond basic literacy was not encouraged, it was questioned, doubted, or ignored. Brilliance was considered an anomaly, not a possibility, and curiosity itself could be viewed as dangerous. At the same time, America was obsessed with progress. The nation celebrated inventions, exhibitions, and scientific breakthroughs. The telephone, electricity, and industrial machines were transforming cities, and world fairs showcased human advancement. Yet this progress was selective. Black Americans were excluded from the narrative of genius and innovation, often displayed instead as laborers or, worse, as subjects for study rather than thinkers with minds of their own. Newspapers played a powerful role in shaping public perception. Sensational headlines were common, especially when a story challenged accepted beliefs. When something did not fit neatly into society's expectations, especially involving race, it was often framed as a curiosity, a mystery, or a threat. Facts were bent to entertain, and truth was filtered through prejudice. This environment meant that any extraordinary black intellect would attract attention, not as a miracle, but as a problem demanding explanation. Fear sat just beneath the surface of daily life. Lynchings were reported casually, often without consequence, and legal systems rarely protected black citizens. Being noticed could be as dangerous as being invisible. To stand out intellectually in such a climate was risky, because excellence could provoke resentment, disbelief, or violent backlash. A gifted black child was not simply unusual, they were unsettling to the social order. It was within this tense, unforgiving America of 1897 that Lydia Johnson's story began. A world that insisted it already knew her limits was about to be confronted with a mind it could not categorize, control, or explain. And that contradiction alone was enough to shake the foundations of what science, society, and power believed to be true. Lydia Johnson's early childhood unfolded quietly in a world that expected very little from her the moment she was born. Like most black children in the late 19th century, her life was shaped by routine labor, strict discipline, and limited opportunity. Her family lived modestly, focused on survival rather than ambition, and there was no expectation that a child like Lydia would ever be noticed beyond her immediate community. Nothing about her circumstances suggested she would become remarkable. Yet even as a toddler, Lydia displayed an unusual awareness of her surroundings. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing conversations, remembering details others overlooked. Family members noticed that she rarely needed instructions repeated and seemed to understand complex ideas long before they were explained to her. She asked questions that felt unsettling in their depth, questions that carried logic beyond her years, as if her mind was moving faster than her body could keep up with. By the time she reached early school age, Lydia's memory was already extraordinary. She could recall entire passages after hearing them once and repeat stories word for word days later. Numbers came to her instinctively, not as symbols to be memorized but as patterns she intuitively grasped. While other children struggled with basic lessons, Lydia completed them almost instantly, then sat quietly, waiting, as though her mind had already moved far ahead. Her emotional maturity was just as striking. Lydia showed a calm focus uncommon for children her age, rarely distracted, rarely restless. She seemed aware that her differences needed to be hidden, that standing out invited unwanted attention. This quiet restraint made her brilliance easy to overlook at first, blending into classrooms and homes where no one was prepared to recognize genius in a black child. At home, small moments hinted at something far greater. Lydia corrected adults without arrogance, gently pointing out inconsistencies in their words. She learned to read rapidly, sometimes teaching herself from scraps of paper or borrowed books. When asked how she knew certain things, she often could not explain it. She simply did. Her understanding seemed instinctive, as though knowledge arrived fully formed, rather than learned step by step. Teachers initially mistook her silence for obedience rather than intellect. It was only when she began finishing lessons, far ahead of schedule, answering questions no one had asked yet, that her abilities became impossible to ignore. Even then, adults searched for ordinary explanations: good memory, luck, imitation, anything except the truth that Lydia's mind functioned on a level they had never expected to encounter. These early years shaped Lydia in lasting ways. She learned caution alongside intelligence, awareness alongside curiosity. Growing up in a society that denied her potential forced her to navigate brilliance quietly, carrying a mind far larger than the world was willing to allow. Long before science ever noticed her, Lydia had already learned that being extraordinary came with a cost. The first clear signs of Lydia Johnson's unusual intelligence appeared in ways that were impossible to dismiss, even by those determined not to see them. What began as small curiosities, finishing lessons too quickly, remembering details with eerie precision, soon evolved into moments that left adults unsettled. Lydia did not simply memorize information, she understood it, connecting ideas across subjects in a way that felt unnatural for a child of her age. Her grasp of language was especially striking. Lydia spoke with clarity and structure far beyond her years, forming complete, logical arguments instead of simple answers. She used words correctly without being taught their formal meanings, often surprising teachers by applying vocabulary in precise and unexpected ways. Reading was not a challenge for her, it became a gateway. Once she learned the basics, she advanced rapidly, absorbing material meant for much older students. Mathematics revealed an even deeper mystery. Lydia could solve problems in her head that others needed chalk and time to work through. She recognized numerical patterns instinctively, offering correct answers without being able to explain the steps that led her there. When asked how she arrived at a solution, she often paused, searching for words, as though translating thoughts that existed beyond ordinary reasoning. Her intelligence was not limited to academics. Lydia showed an advanced ability to observe human behavior, noticing emotional shifts and unspoken tensions. She anticipated reactions, adjusted her responses, and navigated social situations with a quiet, strategic awareness. Adults sometimes felt uncomfortable around her, sensing that she perceived more than she should, that she understood things no child was expected to grasp. What truly alarmed her teachers was Lydia's ability to correct mistakes, not only in lessons, but in instruction itself. When facts were presented incorrectly, she gently questioned them, citing sources or logic to support her doubts. These moments challenged authority, and in a rigid classroom shaped by race and hierarchy, such challenges were not welcomed. Her intelligence disrupted the expected order. Attempts were made to slow her progress, to keep her aligned with other students. Extra work was avoided, advanced materials withheld, as though limiting her exposure could limit her mind. But Lydia continued to grow intellectually, learning from whatever fragments of information she could access. Knowledge, once encountered, stayed with her permanently. By this stage, it was clear that Lydia's mind did not fit existing definitions of intelligence. She was not merely gifted, she was anomalous, a contradiction to everything society claimed to know about race, intellect, and capability. The signs were undeniable, and soon, her brilliance would draw attention far beyond the classroom, attention that would change her life forever. The first reactions from Lydia Johnson's teachers were not admiration, but confusion mixed with suspicion. In classrooms where black children were expected to struggle, Lydia's effortless mastery felt like a disruption rather than an achievement. Teachers initially assumed cheating, copying, or coaching at home, searching for any explanation that would make her performance seem ordinary. The possibility that she was genuinely exceptional was the last conclusion they were willing to accept. Some teachers tested her quietly, altering questions, changing numbers, or asking her to explain answers aloud. Each time, Lydia responded with calm precision, solving problems on the spot or explaining concepts with a clarity that embarrassed the adults questioning her. Instead of relief, these demonstrations deepened their discomfort. Her intelligence exposed the low expectations built into the system itself. Others reacted defensively. A few teachers began avoiding calling on Lydia altogether, preferring not to draw attention to her abilities. Praise was withheld, not because it was undeserved, but because acknowledging her brilliance felt dangerous. To praise her openly would mean admitting that their beliefs about intelligence and about race were fundamentally wrong. There were moments when Lydia's teachers tried to reassert control by disciplining her for speaking out of turn or questioning instructions. What would have been encouraged as curiosity in a white child was labeled insolence when it came from Lydia. Her calm corrections were interpreted as challenges to authority, and her confidence was framed as disobedience. Whispers began to circulate among faculty. Some speculated that Lydia was a rare exception, while others suggested something was unnatural about her abilities. Instead of celebrating her mind, they framed it as a puzzle, even a problem. The language used around her shifted from bright to peculiar, subtly transforming admiration into unease. A few educators attempted to recommend her for advanced instruction, but such suggestions were quickly dismissed. There were no systems in place to nurture a black child's extraordinary intellect. The school's role, as they saw it, was to maintain order, not to cultivate genius that challenged social norms. By the time Lydia's teachers accepted that her intelligence was real, it no longer felt like a gift to them. It felt like a liability, something that could draw unwanted attention, provoke controversy, or threaten established hierarchies. And so, the very people meant to guide her learning became the first to quietly fear what Lydia Johnson's mind represented. Racial bias in science during the late 19th century was not subtle, it was systematic, published, and proudly defended. Scientists of the era claimed to measure intelligence through skull size, facial angles, and other pseudoscientific methods that conveniently reinforced existing racial hierarchies. These theories were taught as fact, not speculation, and they shaped how every discovery was interpreted. Any evidence that contradicted these beliefs was treated not as truth, but as an error needing correction. Black intelligence was framed as an impossibility rather than a spectrum. When black individuals demonstrated exceptional ability, scientists often argued it was imitation, coincidence, or the result of white influence. Genius, they claimed, could not naturally emerge from a race they had already classified as inferior. This bias meant that brilliance in a black child like Lydia Johnson did not inspire curiosity, it provoked denial. Medical journals of the time openly published arguments asserting that black minds matured earlier, but peaked lower, a claim used to dismiss signs of advanced childhood intelligence. Lydia's abilities would have been interpreted through this lens, her early brilliance seen not as potential, but as an abnormality destined to fade. Such theories allowed scientists to acknowledge what they saw without surrendering their beliefs. Instead of studying black intelligence to understand it, science sought to explain it away. Researchers preferred to isolate cases like Lydia's, labeling them anomalies rather than evidence. By doing so, they protected the broader narrative that intelligence followed racial lines. An exception could be tolerated, a pattern could not. Even the language used in scientific discussions revealed deep prejudice. Black subjects were described as specimens rather than individuals, their abilities discussed in detached, dehumanizing terms. Emotional intelligence, creativity, and reasoning were ignored in favor of narrow metrics designed to fail them. Science did not ask what black minds could do. It asked why they supposedly could not. This bias also dictated who was allowed to be studied seriously. White children displaying genius were nurtured and documented, while black children were doubted, scrutinized, or excluded. Opportunities for formal evaluation, mentorship, or academic advancement were systematically denied. Lydia Johnson's mind existed outside the boundaries science had drawn, and science was unprepared to meet her where she stood. In this environment, Lydia's brilliance became a threat to scientific authority. To accept her intelligence as genuine would require admitting that foundational theories were wrong. And so, rather than rewriting those theories, science chose the easier path, questioning the child instead of questioning itself. As word of Lydia Johnson's abilities spread beyond the classroom, the response shifted from disbelief to intrusion. Medical professionals and academic observers began to take an interest, not out of concern for her well-being, but out of a desire to classify her. In 1897, examinations were less about understanding the mind and more are about proving theories, and Lydia soon found herself treated less like a child and more like a living contradiction. Doctors subjected her to interviews and tests that felt cold and impersonal. She was asked to repeat long sequences of numbers, recall passages read only once, and solve logic problems far beyond what was typical for her age. Each correct answer was met not with praise, but with tightened expressions and hurried note-taking. Her success complicated the conclusions they had already written in their heads. Physical measurements followed. Her skull was measured, her facial features scrutinized, her body compared against charts designed to rank intelligence through appearance. These examinations reflected the flawed belief that intellect could be seen, measured, and confined to bone and proportion. When Lydia's physical traits failed to align with the results of her cognitive tests, confusion deepened rather than clarity emerging. Some examiners suggested environmental explanations. Perhaps she had been secretly taught by a white benefactor. They speculated or memorized material without understanding it. Others implied deception, questioning whether the tests were flawed, rather than questioning their assumptions. The idea that Lydia's intelligence was innate and exceptional was too disruptive to accept. Lydia herself remained quiet throughout these procedures. She answered questions calmly, followed instructions precisely, and displayed no signs of stress or arrogance. Yet inside, she sensed that these adults were not there to help her. Their questions carried an edge, as though they were searching for a mistake that would restore their comfort. The results of these examinations were often recorded vaguely or selectively. Clear evidence of her brilliance was softened with cautious language, framed as unusual or inconclusive. Rather than publish findings that challenged racial theories, many chose silence or ambiguity. Truth was present, but it was carefully obscured. By the end of these medical encounters, Lydia had been measured, tested, and dissected intellectually, yet never truly seen. Science had examined her body and her mind, but refused to acknowledge what stood plainly before it. A child whose intelligence could not be explained without dismantling the prejudice science itself was built upon. As whispers about Lydia Johnson spread, newspapers quickly seized the story, sensing its potential to both shock and intrigue readers. In an era obsessed with curiosities and human anomalies, a black child whose intellect surpassed expectations was irresistible. Headlines hinted at mystery rather than achievement, framing Lydia not as a gifted girl, but as a puzzle that needed solving. The press did not ask how to support her. They asked how to explain her away. Articles often exaggerated or distorted the facts. Lydia was described in dramatic language, her intelligence portrayed as eerie, unnatural, or freakish. Journalists focused less on what she knew and more on why she should not know it. By doing so, they reinforced racial stereotypes while pretending to challenge them. Her brilliance became spectacle, not substance. Public reaction followed quickly. Some readers expressed fascination, while others reacted with hostility or disbelief. Letters to editors questioned the validity of the reports, accusing newspapers of fabricating stories for attention. Others warned that such narratives were dangerous, arguing that portraying black intelligence as exceptional threatened the social order. Lydia's mind, once quietly observed, had become a public controversy. The attention brought strangers to her doorstep, curious observers, self-proclaimed experts, and opportunists hoping to witness something extraordinary. Instead of privacy, Lydia and her family were exposed to scrutiny and judgment. What should have been a moment of recognition became a burden, turning her daily life into a performance stage for outsiders. Newspapers also selectively quoted scientists and educators, often choosing voices that downplayed Lydia's significance. Any authority willing to dismiss her abilities was amplified, while those who spoke honestly were minimized or ignored. The press shaped the narrative carefully, ensuring that readers remained comfortable with existing beliefs. Lydia herself was rarely quoted directly. Her voice was filtered through reporters who framed her words to fit their stories. She was talked about, analyzed, and debated, yet seldom allowed to speak for herself. In print, she became an object rather than a person, a symbol rather than a child. By the time the public's fascination began to fade, the damage had already been done. Lydia Johnson was known, but not understood. Her name circulated widely, yet the truth of her intelligence was buried beneath sensationalism, fear, and bias, leaving behind a distorted legacy shaped by ink rather than honesty. Academic skepticism toward Lydia Johnson was fierce and unrelenting, rooted as much in prejudice as in doubt. Scholars and educators of the time refused to accept that a young black girl could naturally possess such extraordinary intelligence. Instead of celebrating her abilities, they questioned her origins, her environment, and even the validity of the observers reporting her achievement. Every assertion about her brilliance was met with hesitation, correction, or outright dismissal. Some academics attempted to downplay her abilities by comparing her to gifted white children, framing her accomplishments as coincidental rather than innate. They suggested that any intelligence she displayed could be explained by tutoring, memorization, or luck. By minimizing her achievements, they preserved their own worldview and avoided confronting uncomfortable truths about race and capability. Peer-reviewed journals and educational bulletins often refused to publish accounts of her abilities. When mentions did appear, they were couched in cautious language, emphasizing anomaly over merit. Phrases like extraordinarily unusual or inexplicable case became common, allowing the intellectual community to acknowledge her existence without challenging entrenched hierarchies or admitting systemic bias. Even well-meaning academics approached her with suspicion. Offers of mentorship or advanced study were tempered by underlying assumptions that her brilliance was temporary, unnatural, or unsustainable. Rather than nurture her potential, they observed it like an experiment, documenting outcomes as if she were a specimen rather than a child with a future. Their skepticism limited opportunities, turning curiosity into a barrier. The academic debate extended beyond her school and local community, reaching regional conferences and informal networks of educators. Reports of Lydia's mind were circulated, discussed, and dissected, yet conclusions consistently emphasized doubt. Intelligence in a black child did not fit prevailing theories, and for many, it could not be permitted to exist without undermining authority. Her teachers, already cautious, found their assessments scrutinized and second-guessed. Any endorsement of her abilities was treated with suspicion, making it risky to advocate for her advancement. Lydia's achievements were acknowledged privately but rarely celebrated publicly, and her potential was constrained by the fear of challenging academic norms. In the end, this skepticism created a paradox. The very intelligence that made Lydia extraordinary also made her invisible in academic circles. She was too brilliant to be ignored entirely, yet too exceptional to be embraced. Her mind became a subject of debate rather than inspiration, a reminder that true genius often struggles to be recognized in a world determined to deny it. Public fascination with Lydia Johnson grew rapidly, fueled by a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and underlying fear. People from all walks of life were drawn to stories of a child whose intellect seemed impossible for someone of her age and background. Unlike typical news stories, this one ignited conversations in homes, workplaces, and social gatherings as adults debated the nature of her abilities and the implications for what they thought they knew about intelligence. Children in her community, too, took notice. Some looked up to her with awe, seeing her as a model of possibility, while others were confused or intimidated by how effortlessly she outpaced them. Lydia's presence challenged the everyday assumptions about learning and achievement, not just for adults but for her peers, reshaping social dynamics in subtle but lasting ways. The fascination was not limited to admiration. Many people were skeptical, questioning whether her talents were genuine or exaggerated. Rumors circulated about secret tutors or hidden advantages, and some accused her family of embellishing her accomplishments. In this way, public interest became a double-edged sword. It brought recognition, but also scrutiny and suspicion. Newspapers and periodicals amplified this fascination, often dramatizing her story to attract readership. Descriptions of her mind as mysterious or unexplainable were repeated across towns and cities, turning her into a figure of intrigue. Readers were captivated by the tension between the ordinary expectations of childhood and the extraordinary reality she represented. Lecturers, educators, and curious visitors sought opportunities to see her perform tasks or answer questions, hoping to witness the intelligence that had stirred so much discussion. Lydia's daily life became punctuated by these demonstrations. where she was expected to validate the public's fascination continually. It was a burden she carried from an early age, performing not for pleasure, but for the validation of others. Despite the public attention, little was done to support or cultivate her abilities. Fascination did not translate into educational opportunity or mentorship. It remained superficial, focused more on spectacle than substance. While people marveled at her mind, very few considered how to nurture it responsibly, leaving Lydia to navigate a world that both admired and constrained her. Ultimately, public fascination shaped Lydia's legacy as much as her intelligence did. Her story became a topic of conversation, a symbol of possibility, and a challenge to social norms, but also a cautionary tale of how society can recognize brilliance without truly understanding or supporting it. Her life showed that fascination alone is insufficient when the structures around genius are unwilling or unable to accommodate it. Attempts to explain Lydia Johnson's mind revealed as much about the biases of the era as they did about her abilities. Scholars, doctors, and educators scrambled to find reasons for her brilliance that would not challenge prevailing beliefs about race. Every proposed explanation was filtered through the lens of skepticism, often prioritizing comfort over truth. They wanted a solution that preserved their worldview, not one that acknowledged her exceptional intellect. Some suggested that Lydia had been secretly taught by someone outside her family, implying that her intelligence was borrowed rather than innate. Others theorized that she had an extraordinary memory rather than true comprehension, framing her accomplishments as repetition rather than reasoning. These explanations minimized the threat her abilities posed to accepted ideas about racial hierarchy. Psychological and medical interpretations followed, though rudimentary by today's standards. Specialists tried to categorize her intellect using measurements, tests, and observation. They documented her problem solving, her memory, and her reasoning skills, but always framed their findings as anomalies, rather than genuine evidence of genius. By doing so, they could acknowledge her achievements without upsetting social norms. Educators speculated that environmental factors, such as reading at home or access to stimulating materials, accounted for her brilliance. This argument suggested that her mind had been shaped externally, sidestepping the possibility that her intelligence was natural and profound. In every case, the conclusion avoided giving Lydia credit for innate ability, maintaining a narrative in which exceptional black intelligence remained explainable rather than remarkable. Some explanations veered into pseudoscience. There were claims linking her abilities to physical traits, such as the size or shape of her head, echoing widespread but flawed beliefs about race and intellect. When these theories failed to align with reality, scientists often dismissed the discrepancy as error in measurement rather than questioning the assumptions behind their models. Even sympathetic observers struggled to articulate how her mind worked. Teachers and scholars alike expressed admiration privately, but hesitated publicly to describe her as genuinely exceptional. It was easier to theorize, to rationalize, or to dismiss than to confront the uncomfortable truth that Lydia Johnson challenged the very foundation of what people thought they knew about intelligence and race. Ultimately, all attempts to explain Lydia's abilities fell short. Every theory, either diluted her brilliance, misrepresented her achievements, or avoided acknowledging the reality of her mind. Her intelligence remained a mystery not because it was unknowable, but because society was unwilling or unable to accept it. In trying to explain her, the world revealed more about its own limitations than about Lydia herself. Lydia Johnson's sudden disappearance from public records remains one of the most perplexing aspects of her story. After years of fascination, scrutiny, and testing, she seemed to vanish from newspapers, academic notes, and local accounts, leaving behind only fragments of her extraordinary life. The reasons for this disappearance were never documented, sparking speculation that has persisted for generations. Some historians suggest that her family may have moved, seeking privacy or safety in a world that treated her brilliance as both a marvel and a threat. In an era when black children were vulnerable to exploitation, unwanted attention could be dangerous. Avoiding public scrutiny may have been a deliberate choice to protect Lydia from those who might have used her intelligence for personal gain or to reinforce racist ideologies. Others propose that societal pressures contributed to her withdrawal. A child whose mind outpaced not only her peers but also the adults around her could have faced isolation, misunderstanding, or subtle hostility. The expectations placed upon her to perform, to explain, to justify her intellect may have become too heavy, prompting a retreat from the public eye. It is also possible that Lydia's educational journey shifted in ways that were never recorded. She may have been quietly admitted to an advanced school, mentored privately, or even left formal education altogether. Without documentation, however, her trajectory remains speculative, illustrating how exceptional lives can be erased when society refuses to accommodate them. The media's earlier fascination may have contributed to her disappearance. Headlines that once heralded her brilliance could just as easily have invited danger or ridicule. Families often shielded extraordinary children from continued exposure, fearing that fame, even in the context of intellect, could bring unwanted consequences in a racially biased society. Her disappearance highlights the fragility of historical memory, especially for black individuals in the late 19th century. Records were incomplete, newspapers selective, and educational institutions often uninterested in chronicling the achievements of those outside the racial majority. As a result, much of what we know about Lydia Johnson comes from fleeting mentions and anecdotal reports. Ultimately, the absence of Lydia from historical documentation leaves a haunting question: what became of the girl whose mind defied science? Her disappearance underscores the tragedy of lost potential, the invisibility imposed by prejudice, and the enduring mystery of a life that challenged the very assumptions of her time. The legacy of Lydia Johnson as a forgotten genius remains as complex as her life. Though her name appears only briefly in scattered accounts, her story challenges the assumptions of both her era and ours. Lydia's brilliance was undeniable, yet society's inability to recognize, nurture, or protect her potential left her extraordinary mind largely invisible to history. Her life forces us to confront the limitations imposed by racial and social bias. In 1897, the very fact that she was a young black girl determined how her intelligence would be received, measured, and ultimately ignored. Her story demonstrates that talent alone is not enough. It must be seen, supported, and recorded to survive beyond the moment. For modern audiences, Lydia Johnson represents a symbol of untapped potential. She reminds us that history is full of individuals whose abilities were suppressed or overlooked because they did not fit existing narratives. Her story urges a reevaluation of how society identifies genius, emphasizing that brilliance does not conform to expectations of race, gender, or class. The mystery surrounding her life also underscores the fragility of historical memory. Without proper documentation, extraordinary stories can be lost, leaving only fragments for future generations to piece together. Lydia's disappearance from records serves as a warning. The voices and achievements of marginalized communities can vanish unless actively preserved. Her legacy is also a testament to resilience. Even in a world that doubted, tested, and questioned her every move, Lydia demonstrated an intellect that could not be contained. Her mind challenged scientific dogma, educational assumptions, and societal norms, revealing the courage it takes simply to exist as a gifted individual in an oppressive environment. Lydia Johnson's story inspires reflection on contemporary issues as well. It highlights the need for equitable education, opportunities for nurturing talent in all communities, and the vigilance required to ensure that brilliance is recognized and supported rather than ignored or exploited. Her life echoes forward, urging society to do better for children who, like her, are extraordinary yet vulnerable to neglect. Ultimately, Lydia Johnson remains both an enigma and a beacon. While we may never know the full trajectory of her life, her impact persists in the questions she raises. How many minds have been overlooked? How many geniuses lost to prejudice? Her legacy is a silent challenge to acknowledge and honor intelligence wherever it emerges, no matter how inconvenient it may seem to the world around it.